And the drive between Sonora, or between Odessa and Sonora, there were two different routes that you could take. And one of them, I'll never forget it. And I've got to do some research and find out exactly what this means now, because this morning it just kind of came to me again, and I don't really understand all of it. But I remember one day we were driving from Odessa to visit my dad's parents in Sonora out at the ranch, and we're driving along, and Daddy pulls off to the side of the road, and it's on a little two-lane highway, and he pulls off to the side. There's a guardrail, not a whole lot of room, and he has us boys get out and look over the guardrail, and it goes down a hillside, and he said, "Boys, right down there is where Bigfoot Wallace left the stagecoach tracks." Don't know exactly what that means. I did, at one time, I came across something in a history book or something about Bigfoot Wallace, and I can't remember if he was with the Pony Express or if he was with the military or what it was. But Daddy had told me that the Indians were chasing him, and he was driving the stagecoach, and right down there, boys, is where Bigfoot Wallace left the stagecoach tracks. So then, anytime we were going to Sonora, he'd say, "Which way do you want to go?" And of course, which way do you think my brother and I always wanted to go? We wanted to go by where Bigfoot Wallace left the stagecoach tracks. There's also a place out at the ranch where I grew up. There was a hillside, and on the side of the hill, there's a little cave. It's kind of a half donut-shaped cave, not real big in there, but have any of you ever heard of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid? Have you ever heard of the Hole in the Wall Bunch? Have you ever heard of Will Carver? No, never had. Will Carver was an outlaw back in the 1800s who actually hung out with Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. At one time there's a picture of Butch Cassidy, Sundance Kid, and about 4 or 5 other well-known outlaws. I think Blackjack Ketchum was one of them, and one of the guys is Will Carver. Will Carver was shot on Main Street in Sonora, Texas, back I think in 1902 or something like that, and he's buried there. But at one time, Will Carver had a bunch of outlaws that were known as the Hole in the Wall Bunch, and they got that name because they hid out in that cave there at the ranch where I grew up. And so that was always a cool thing, would be to take a girlfriend out to the hole in the wall where the outlaws lived, you know. Yeah. Watch out for rattlesnakes and stuff. But anyway, you know, when you hear stories like that, when you're a kid, they stick with you, don't they? You know, those stories about the heroes and the outlaws and stuff like that, they stay with you. You know, we have lost that storytelling with our kids these days. We don't tell them stories very often. And if we do, we tell them stories to protect them. I had a mother tell me the other day she was really upset because her neighbor had told their 7-year-old daughter that if you don't do what's right in God's eyes, you may go to hell. And hell is a terrible place. It's on fire all the time. And it's anguish and pain, and it's a terrible place to go, and so you don't want to go to hell. And this mother was telling me, you know, she couldn't believe her neighbor had done that and upset my daughter and all this kind of stuff. And I thought, good. Maybe more kids ought to be upset these days at the prospect of going to hell. We've gotten away from telling these kind of stories. And especially if there are great stories and then they make a movie out of them, it seems to take some of the reality away from them. Now that they made a movie out of it, it's make-believe. Kind of like the story of the Exodus, the plagues. Because they made a movie out of it, people watch the movie and they think it's all made up, and we tell it as if it's not really a true story. But these things actually did happen. And in our study through the book of Exodus, this week we read, or we're supposed to have read, Exodus chapter 6 through 12. Supposed to read it about 5 times, sit down, read it all in one sitting, and do that 5 times during the week. But we read the story about the plagues that took place. And most of us are familiar with the plagues in some way. We're not going to go into all of the details, but we're going to look at some of these mighty acts that God did. And we're going to see maybe some of the purpose in them, maybe some of the power in them. But we're going to find out by the time we get done that there was a purpose for everything that takes place here. The people have been captive the people of Israel have been captive in Egypt for 430 years. And this is in fulfillment of what God had said to Abraham. He said, your people are going to go into a land, they're going to become slaves for 400 years. And we're going to read that right on the day, 430 years after they went into Egypt, they leave. And some people say, why does God say 400, but they were in there for 430 days? Well, the first 430 years, the first 30 years they weren't slaves. That's when Joseph came down, and so for 30 years they lived in the land, and things went well for them. And then remember, at the beginning of Exodus, it says, a new king rose to power who did not know Joseph, and that's when they became slaves. And so they were in the land for 430 years. And now God has heard His people crying out, and now He has come to deliver them. And He begins by a mighty act using Aaron's staff. And He gives Moses and Aaron instructions. Go to Pharaoh and tell him something. And what we're going to notice is some of these mighty acts, some of these plagues start with a warning or a command. Let my people go, is what God says throughout all of them when he gives orders to Pharaoh. And a lot of times He says, and if you don't, then this is what's going to happen. So He gives a warning and a command that goes with it. In the story, beginning in chapter 7, the first 13 verses, we have this kind of warning. We have this command that Moses and Aaron are supposed to go to Pharaoh and say, let my people go. When you get there, Pharaoh says, I want you to do something to show me that you're coming from God. Take Aaron's staff, throw it on the ground, and it's going to become a snake. Pretty impressive trick, right? Except that Pharaoh's wise men or his magicians did the same trick. And so it didn't prove anything to Pharaoh. But then we see at the end of the story that Aaron's staff actually eats up the other staffs, or Aaron's snake eats up the other snakes, however you want it to do. But we notice at the end of this that Pharaoh's heart was hardened. Now we're going to talk a little more about that later on, because that's always one of the big questions that comes up is, did Pharaoh harden his heart, or did God harden his heart? And in this text, in chapter 7, verse 13, all it says is that Pharaoh's heart was hardened. And I think the NIV said his heart was hard, or his heart became hard. This is a passive verb, which means that something acted upon it. Now, did he act upon it? Did God act upon it? It's really not specified in there. But like I said, we're going to look a little more at that later on. The next mighty act is when the changing of the blood, or the water, into blood in chapter 7, verse 14 through 24. And it begins with a warning or a command, and there is a typo here. I put 7:18. Well, 7:18 doesn't say much, except the fish in the Nile will die, but it actually begins up in verse 16. Verse 16 through 18 is God's warning or command to Pharaoh, let my people go. If you don't do this, then this is what's going to happen. All the water is going to turn to blood, and the fish are going to die, everything's going to smell, nobody's going to be able to drink any of the water that comes. And so sure enough, the water becomes blood. All the buckets of the house and everything else. And then Pharaoh's wise men are able to do the same thing. And you think to yourself, well now, if all the water's already turned into blood, how do they turn more water into blood? Where's the water they get? Well, notice it says in the text that all the Egyptians had to dig down along the banks of the Nile to get their water. So there was still water. And so the wise men, evidently, when they dug down, they got a bucket of water and changed it to blood. Real smart, isn't it? We'll think about that a little more in a minute. But at the end of that, Pharaoh's heart was hardened again. Pharaoh sees these mighty acts, and he just doesn't, still not going to let the people go. So the next mighty act is frogs everywhere. Chapter 7, verse 25 through chapter 8, verse 15. Begins again with a warning and a command. Let my people go. let my people go. If you don't, there's going to be frogs everywhere. How many of you like frogs? I'm not saying frog legs, but I mean live frogs. How many of you like frogs? You got two weird people in here, okay? I don't like frogs. I grew up in a place, we had rattlesnakes everywhere. Snakes don't really bother me. They might startle me a little bit, but that's okay. I'll pick up a rock and me and the snake are good to go. You know, they don't really bother me that much. But I'll come around the side of my house sometimes at night after I've gone to put the dogs up or something and step next to a great big old greasy, ugly, slimy frog. And that is, I don't like frogs. Imagine having frogs everywhere. Your floor's covered. Your bed covered, your cabinets covered, your cupboards covered, everything covered with frogs. And God says, if you don't let my people go, that's what's going to happen. And so that's what happens. Frogs everywhere. Moses and Aaron raise up the staff. Frogs just start coming out. And I love this. Then the wise men, they do the same thing. Like there weren't enough frogs to begin with. You know, I mean, you would think that Pharaoh would say, hey, you guys make the frogs go away. Don't bring more frogs. But the wise men bring more frogs. But evidently, they can't reverse it. Because what we see then is that Pharaoh asks Moses to pray that the frogs will be gone. You know, well, hey, we've had enough of these frogs. And evidently, he can't go to his magicians and say, make them go away. They can't do it. And so we see a chink maybe in Pharaoh's army when he goes to Moses and he says, pray for them. Get rid of the frogs. And so Moses then says, okay, I'll do it. You tell me what time you want all the frogs gone. Now there's a reason for this. Because Moses wants to make sure that Pharaoh understands this isn't just some natural phenomenon. All of a sudden, all the frogs just decide to come out of the river, and a day or two later, they're going to go away. And you know, then Pharaoh can say, well, you didn't do it. Your God didn't do that. That was just a natural thing. But Moses says to him, you tell me when. And so Pharaoh gives him the time. And at that time, Moses prays, and they're gone. Well, then, when Pharaoh sees relief, his heart, he hardened his heart. We're going to see a lot of things in Pharaoh that are probably very similar to us. I've seen it, and I know you have too. People who, in the middle of hardships, in the middle of illness, in the middle of a possible catastrophic event in their life, they become very faithful. They pray, and they'll come to church, and they'll come forward, and they'll repent, and they'll want to be baptized, and they'll want to give their life to God, and then as soon as everything smooths over, and they find out it wasn't cancer, it was just something or another going on. A month or two goes by, and they're no longer around. A lot of little Pharaoh in all of us, I think. But Pharaoh sees relief, and he hardened his heart. And then we have gnats or lice. The word can be translated either one. I'm not sure which would be the best. You know, I wouldn't really want either one of them. But you've got gnats or lice everywhere. Again, this is an interesting one. There is no warning. God doesn't say, go to Pharaoh and tell him, let my people go. He's done that 3 times already. But this time, he just tells Aaron, strike the staff on the ground, and all of the dust is going to become gnats or lice, and it's going to go everywhere. Not a warning at all. It's almost as if God has said, I'm tired of talking to this guy. I'm just going to make things happen. And so there it is. But it's interesting, the magicians now, they can't repeat this one. No matter what they try to do, they can't make gnats and lice appear. Why would you want to? But, anyway, so they then go to Pharaoh and they say, this is the finger of God. Pharaoh, this is not something you want to be messing with here. This is not just magic. This is not some powerful guy. This is from God himself. So we begin to see that Pharaoh had a little bit of a chink, but we begin to see something in his people here as well. But Pharaoh's heart was hardened and he would not listen. So then, flies everywhere. You have the warning or the command. And except this time, God gets a little more specific. He says there's going to be flies everywhere except in the land of Goshen. Now, evidently there were frogs all in the land of Goshen, and gnats all in the land of Goshen, or something, but for some reason, here at this place, God says there's going to be a distinction between my people and your people, between the place where my people live and the place where your people live, because there's not going to be any flies down in the land of Goshen. But you're going to have flies everywhere. And God says, and this is going to happen tomorrow. God says a specific time, so Pharaoh understands this is not just some, natural phenomenon that occurs. Remember once when I was a kid, we were shearing sheep, and it was in the spring of the year, and so we're all outside, and we see a big thunderstorm coming. And the great thing about living in the part of West Texas where I did is you can see for a long ways, and you see this big thunderstorm coming, and the clouds are coming, and big tall thunderheads, and you can see the rain coming down. And so we all got into the barn so we wouldn't get drenched, because it was a downpour. And we're standing there, we've got the doors to the barn closed till they're open about that much, and I remember I'm standing there watching this storm come. And I see it coming up the road. You can see the rain pelting the ground, and it's actually stirring up dust, and then there's mud behind it. It's like this wall of rain coming. And just before it gets there, about 100 feet before that wall of rain hit the barn, guess what came in the barn? Flies. I had never seen anything like it. Evidently, every fly within a 100-mile radius was trying to outrun that rainstorm. And they started pouring through that little opening in the barn there. And I'm standing there watching, and you see the rain coming, and there's this dark cloud that starts to form in front of it. And I said to my cousin, I said, "Hey, what's that?" Yeah. And just pelted with flies. And it reminded me of this story. There's flies everywhere. But notice there's no mention of the magicians. They don't try to make more flies. It doesn't say they can't make more flies. There's just no mention of them at all. At this point in the story, it begins to be about God and Pharaoh. And so Pharaoh, finally, after all of this, he says to Moses, "Fine, you can go and sacrifice, but you've got to do it here in the land." Remember, what they wanted was to leave. They wanted to go out into the wilderness so they could worship their God. That's what the plea has been all along. Let my people go, that they may go into the wilderness and worship me. And so finally now, Pharaoh's had the frogs, the lice, the water, and all of this other stuff. He finally says, "All right, go and sacrifice to your God, but you've got to do it here in the land." In other words, go, but don't go very far. Moses says, "No, you can't do that. God said for us to go out into the wilderness." In fact, Moses says, if we offer the sacrifices here, your people are going to riot because they're not going to like our sacrifices. But Moses says that's not what God had in store. God said for us to go completely out of this land. Pharaoh asks again for God to pray for him, but then again it says that Pharaoh's heart was hardened. Pharaoh wanted them to compromise. God wanted everything from them. We're going to talk a little more about that in a moment as well. And then there's the dead animals everywhere. Again, there's a warning, a command. Tomorrow, if you guys don't let my people go, every animal that's in the field is going to be dead, except for those in the land of Goshen. And so there's this warning again. And then there are dead animals everywhere. Again, there's no mention of the magicians at all. But I also wanted to let you know, it says that all of your livestock, all of your sheep, cattle, goats, camels, and everything are all going to be dead. And they were. But later on, if you were reading the story this week, you noticed that in the next plague, a couple of plagues later, it talks about animals. And you think, well, if all the animals died, How were there other animals? Well, notice in verse 4, chapter 9, verse 2, it says, all the animals in the field. Evidently, this plague didn't affect the animals that were living in the barns or that had been brought in out of the fields. And so not all of the animals died, just every animal that was out in the field. But Pharaoh's heart, the text tells us, was still unyielding. No matter what happens, Pharaoh just won't let God be in control. So then there's boils on everything. Chapter 9, verses 8 through 12. Again, there's no warning on this one. It's just, tell you what, take this handful of ashes, throw it up in the air. There's going to be boils all over everything. Boils on everything. And the magicians come back in at this time, but the magicians don't even try to do it. It says the magicians cannot even stand before Moses because of the agony of the boils that are on them everywhere. And then it says in the text that this is the first time that this says this after one of the plagues, is that the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. Again, we're going to talk a little bit more about that later on. And then there's hail on everything. Again, it begins by a warning or a command. Let my people go. If you don't let my people go, there's going to be hail everywhere. But I want you to open your Bibles, chapter 9. Because in verse 14 through 16, we get the first clear statement as to why all of this is taking place. A lot of times people say, why would God be so hard on Pharaoh? Why would he make such agony for the people in Israel? Well, look in chapter 9, beginning in verse 13 with me. Then the Lord said to Moses, get up early in the morning, confront Pharaoh, and say to him, this is what the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, says. Let my people go, so that they may worship me. Or this time I will send the full force of my plague against you and against the officials and your people, so you may know that there is no one like me in all the earth. For by now I could have stretched out my hand and struck you and your people with the plague that would have wiped you off the earth. But I have raised you up for this very purpose, that I may show you my power and that my name may be proclaimed over all the earth. You see, all of this battle is taking place to show how powerful God is. And all of these things are taking place, and the time is given, and they happen in one part of the country but not in another, because that's how awesome and how powerful God is. And God wants that to be known. The officials who feared God obeyed God, obeyed what Moses said. They brought their animals in, but Pharaoh's response, chapter 9, verse 27, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron. This time I have sinned, he said to them. The Lord is right, and I and my people are in the wrong. Pray to the Lord for me. We have had enough thunder and hail. I will let you go. I will let you go. You don't have to stay any longer. Now it sounds like finally Pharaoh's done the right thing, doesn't it? And then Moses says, when I have gone out of the city, I will spread my hands in prayer to the Lord, and the thunder will stop, and there will be no more hail, so that you may know that the earth is the Lord's. But I know that you and your officials still do not fear the Lord. And in verse 34, it says, when Pharaoh saw that the rain and hail and thunder had stopped, he sinned again. And he and his officials hardened their hearts. Little bits that seem to be moving in the right direction, but Pharaoh still won't change. So locusts everywhere. Warning and commands, chapter 10, verses 1 through 6. I want you to read verses 1 and 2 with me. Then the Lord said to Moses, go to Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the hearts of his officials, so that I may perform these miraculous signs of mine among them, that you may tell your children and grandchildren how I dealt harshly with the Egyptians and how I performed my signs among them, and that you may know that I am the Lord. The officials then appeared to Pharaoh in verse 7. They said, "How long must this man be a snare to us? Let the people go, so that they may worship the Lord their God. Do you not yet realize that Egypt is ruined?" This has been a destructive process, and we need to understand that these plagues didn't happen one day after the next. It wasn't like boom, 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 10 days and they're done. These things went on for days, and sometimes there would be a period of time in between them that the people had to deal with the consequences for it. They had to spend a few days cleaning up dead frogs, a few days cleaning up dead lice. A few years ago, Dory and I were up in Dubuque, took our niece up there to a water park hotel, and that was when the mayflies were hatching. I kid you not. If I'm lying, I'm dying. As what's his name? Jerry Clower used to say, "If I'm lying, I'm dying." He had a snowblower up there to clean the sidewalks of dead mayflies, and it stunk just a little bit. And the people in Egypt have been dealing with this. They've been cleaning up frogs and gnats and flies and everything else. It just keeps going on and on. So the officials come, "Can't you see what this is doing to our nation?" And Pharaoh's response finally says to Moses, he says, "I want you to go, but who's going?" Moses says, "Everybody's going." And Pharaoh says, "No, only your men can go." First of all, he said, "Go, but don't go far." Moses says, "No, that's not the way God wants it." Now he says, "You can go, but only your men can go." Moses says, "No, that's not the way that God wants it." And so guess what? Locusts come. Locusts come everywhere. And so then we have Pharaoh's response, chapter 10, verse 16 and 17. "I have sinned against the Lord your God and against you. Now forgive my sin once more and pray to the Lord your God and take away this deadly plague from me." And it sounds like Pharaoh's in the right spot, but in verse 20 we see again that the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. He wouldn't let the people go. So then there's darkness that you can feel. No warning again on this one. No command, but darkness everywhere except for the Israelites. Now notice when it talks about the darkness in the Egyptians, there's darkness, period. Evidently, candles won't even light. Lamps won't light. There is no light whatsoever, but the Israelites have light. That's the distinction that God made. And so Pharaoh's response is, "Okay, fine. Even your women and your kids can go, but leave your livestock here." You see, Pharaoh wants something left there that will make them come back after they've left. And in one of my readings this week, one of the guys said that Satan still uses these same tricks with us. You can get into the religion thing, just don't go too far with it, okay? You can get into the religion thing, but don't involve your wife and your kids or your husband and your kids. Leave them out of it. This is just something between you and God. Or you can get into this religion thing, but don't let it impact your finances or anything. Don't bring your material stuff into it, because you see, Satan wants us to still have a connection to our old life. God says, "I want you to come and I want you to leave everything. Come into a new land. I want you to bring everything you have, your wife, your kids, your family, your husband, and all your material blessings, or your material possessions. I want you to bring it all with you." But the Lord hardens Pharaoh's heart again, verse 27. And then we have the death of the firstborn. Begins in chapter 1, verse 28. It ends in chapter 12, verse 32. Notice in chapter 10, beginning in verse 28, Pharaoh's directive to Moses. He says to Moses, "Get out of my sight. Make sure you do not appear before me again. The day I see your face, you will die." Which really doesn't have the impact it ought to until you put it in the perspective or in the context. This takes place in total darkness. Pharaoh can't see anything, because it's during that 3 days of darkness that you can feel. And notice Pharaoh says, "Get out of my sight." Wherever you are, can't see you, but you're here somewhere. Get out of my sight. Make sure you do not appear before me again. Of course, I couldn't see you if you did. The day you see my face, if the sun ever comes up again, it's funny when you really put it in context there. And again, always before there's either been a warning or a command, or there's nothing at all. But here, Pharaoh gets a warning but no command. God says to Pharaoh, this is what I'm going to do. Chapter 10, verse 29 through chapter 11, verse 8. We're not going to read all of it. But God tells him, you're going to sweep through. All your firstborn are going to die. God doesn't say, let my people go this time. He's told him that over and over again. Now he just tells him what's going to happen. And so there's a command to the Israelites. In chapter 11, beginning in verse 9, the Lord said to Moses, the Pharaoh will refuse. And he gives him the ordinances for the Passover. This is what's going to happen. You guys need to prepare. And so he gives the Passover instructions. This is going to be the first month of your year. Now understand the significance of this, church. This is changing their entire life, their entire calendar. Their world is about to be rocked. Take a lamb on the 10th day of the month, 1-year-old male without defect from sheep or goats, care for it until the 14th and slaughter it at twilight. They're to take the blood, they're to put it on the sides and the tops of the door. Now I want you to look at chapter 12, verse 12 and 13 with me real quick. On the same night, God says, I will pass through Egypt and I will strike down every firstborn, both men and animals, and I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. The blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you. No destructive plague will touch you when I strike Egypt. And down in verse 23, when the Lord goes through the land to strike down the Egyptians, he will see the blood on the top of and the sides of the door frame, and he will pass over the doorway, and he will not permit the destroyer to enter your house. And so that blood, when God sees it, God becomes not only the destroyer who evades, but He also becomes the protector who stands at those houses and will not let the destroyer in. So that blood becomes a protection, it becomes a symbol. And then they're told to eat the meat, roast it over a fire. Don't take the time to boil it or anything. Eat it with bitter herbs. Eat it with unleavened bread because you don't have time for the bread to rise. Roast it, don't boil it or eat it raw. And don't leave anything till morning. Very specific instructions God gives for how they are to eat. How to eat it. Cloak tucked into your belt so you can leave. With your sandals on your feet so you can leave. With your staff in your hand so you can leave. Eat it in haste. It's the Lord's Passover. God is going to do something. Be ready for it when it happens. And that's what this meal is about. And then he says it is to be a lasting ordinance. They're going to have a feast and 7 days of unleavened bread. There's a sacred assembly on the 1st and a sacred assembly on the 7th. And there's no work to be done during that time except the preparation of food. They don't even have Black Friday during this holiday. They don't do any shopping. They don't get on the internet. They don't put up the Christmas lights. They don't do anything except prepare for this meal because it is so sacred and holy. And then down in chapter 12, later on, it gives instructions of who can eat the Passover. No foreigner. Any slave that you've purchased can do it after you've circumcised him. No temporary resident or hired worker can do it. Probably because they wouldn't be circumcised. Any alien can eat it when all of the men and the males in his household have been circumcised. Notice that circumcision is the requirement for any who wants to take of this meal. And then you have the death of the firstborn. It takes place in chapter 12. Again, as I mentioned in our class this morning, it's interesting. The Exodus only takes 11 verses in this whole text. Pharaoh drives them out. Go worship the Lord as you have requested. Take your flocks, your herds, your kids, your wives. Go as far as you want to. And the Egyptians urged the people to hurry and leave the country. I bet they did. I bet they had all the flies and frogs and gnats and lice and locusts they wanted. The Lord, it says, had made the Egyptians favorably disposed of the people, so they plundered the Egyptians. Now I want to look real quickly at Pharaoh's heart. Text says in chapter 4 verse 21 and chapter 7 verse 3, God tells Moses, I'm going to harden his heart. The other 5 verses, 9, 12, 10, 1, 10, 20, 10, 27, and 11, 10, the text specifically says God hardened Pharaoh's heart. In chapter 8 verse 15 and 8 verse 32, it says that Pharaoh hardened his heart. And then we have the other 3 verses where it just says that his heart was hardened. But it doesn't say who did it. So the question is, who hardened Pharaoh's heart? Did God call this man who would have normally given these people up? Did God make him disobey so strongly? Well, the reality, look in verse 9, verse 15, 16, we read this earlier. God says, I raised you up for this very purpose so that everybody will know that I am God over everywhere. And what we need to understand is God worked with Pharaoh's heart. The way Pharaoh's heart already was to accomplish his purpose. When I was in high school, I took an art class. And one of them was ceramics. I made that. About almost 30 years ago, it seems like now. Any of you ever done any pottery? Okay, a couple of you have. If I had made this and then just kind of painted it and set it out somewhere, would it have become hard? We got some of you going, no. And some of you going, yeah. Yeah, it would. Would it have become as hard as it needed to be? No. And therefore you fire it. Okay? Pharaoh's heart was already hard and would have remained hard. God just fired it in order to make out of Pharaoh's heart what God needed. And so God is not some beast who controls and manipulates people. God will work with what's already there to accomplish His will. 2 important passages I want us to get out of this morning. Things that we might overlook. Chapter 10, verses 1 and 2. Then the Lord said to Moses, Go to Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the hearts of his officials, so that I may perform these miraculous signs of mine among them, that you may tell your children and grandchildren how I dealt harshly with the Egyptians and how I performed the signs among them, and that you may know that I am Yahweh. I'm doing this so you can teach your kids. I'm doing this so that you can tell your children what happens when people don't listen to God. I'm doing this so you guys will see how mighty and awesome and powerful I am, and you'll tell your kids. If you don't believe that, chapter 12, verse 26 and 27, and when your children ask you, what does this ceremony mean? You tell them. You tell them the stories. You teach them from the time they're little bitty kids until they're great big kids. You tell them the stories over and over again. Because if you don't, they don't know God. God has given us, as a church, a lasting ordinance, just like He did for them. Something that we use to teach our kids and to tell our kids what God has done. He has given us a meal right here. We call it the Lord's Supper. It was instituted at the Passover meal by Jesus Himself. We are to tell our kids, when the bread comes by, a lot of times what we do is say, you can't take that until you've been baptized. Give it to me. When we ought to take it and we ought to say, do you know what this means? Do you know what this is? Long ago, when God delivered our people from the Egyptians, God told them to eat unleavened bread and be ready to go in a hurry because He was about to deliver them. And He did these plagues to get Pharaoh to let his people go. This bread symbolizes our Exodus, when Jesus came and got ready to lead us to heaven. And that's why we take this bread. And I know there's a lot more to it. The blood, the cup. Kids, do you know what this means? Other than, you can't take that, you haven't been baptized yet, put that grape juice back. Ask them, do you know what that means? And we tell them that it signifies God's protection over us when His Son poured out His blood that we would not die. We tell them the mighty acts of God, the mighty acts of His Son. That's our responsibility, is to tell these things to our kids, to teach our kids what God has done for us. I think sometimes, church, we forget how powerful these stories are. We forget that these stories are true. They're not just myths. Our God is a mighty God. And our God delivers us. And I want to ask you, when was the last time any of you sat down in bed with your kids at night and told them the story of the plagues? Dory and I went and saw a movie called The Life of Pi. Saw it yesterday. Saw it in 3D. Never seen a 3D movie except for at the IMAX, and those make me sick to my stomach. But we saw this one regular screen, 3D, and that was really pretty cool. But there's a scene right at the beginning where the mom has the two boys in bed and she's telling them the story of their gods, their Hindus. And I thought, we as Christians miss that. We need to be sitting down and telling our kids the stories. That's our responsibility. We need to use this lasting ordinance to teach our children what Jesus has done for us. What a mighty God we serve. Our God not only delivered the Israelites from the nation of Egypt, our God has delivered us from the reign of sin and death. He's delivered us from the hands of Satan. He has promised us, if you believe in me, if you trust me, then the blood of my Son will wash you clean. Be buried with Him in baptism, and all your sins will be washed away. I'll raise you up to a new life, and you will never perish. You will live with me forever. Church, that's our Exodus. That's the mighty act that God did for me and you. This morning, if you have never become a part of that Exodus and need to do so, please come forward while we stand.